The most significant charge against Corbyn's leadership has been that he makes Labour unelectable. On the 5th of May, this claim faced its first real electoral test. So have Corbyn's critics been vindicated? Or can we see the beginnings of an anti-austerity alliance that could push Labour to victory in 2020? On this episode of The Fix, we'll discuss Corbyn, elections, and a strategy for the left.
Headline results from the 5th of May elections included the continued collapse of Labour's vote in Scotland, which saw the party beaten into third place behind the SNP and the Tories. In Wales, Labour also lost support to Plaid Cymru, remaining the largest party but failing to gain a majority. In England, Labour has avoided the kind of defeat many predicted, holding on to councils in key marginals such as Nuneaton and Crawley. Still, Corbyn has not turned the tide that saw Labour lose the last general election, winning 13 fewer seats than Ed Miliband managed in 2012. Sadiq Khan's victory in London was Labour's one clear-cut win, as the party returns to City Hall for the first time in 8 years. While Corbyn pronounced the results a success, his opponents predictably called them a failure, and Khan himself offered thinly veiled attacks on Corbyn's leadership within 24 hours of his win. While an imminent coup from the right now looks unlikely, the prospects for Corbyn's Labour remain unclear.
Today I'm joined by Richard Seymour, contributing editor at Salvage and author of Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics. Stephen Bush, who's a special correspondent at The New Statesman. Hilary Wainwright, who's founder and editor of Red Pepper and author of Labour, A Tale of Two Parties. And Neal Lawson, director of Compass and a former advisor to Gordon Brown. Now, in Corbyn's leadership campaign, there was an often heard argument that Labour lost in 2015 because all they offered was austerity light. By electing Corbyn, we could have active opposition to the Tories, but also have a route to real electoral success. Do the results of the 5th of May show that Labour can win elections when it takes on a radical direction? Richard, you're first.
It's too soon to tell. In a way, the results weren't as catastrophic as were anticipated. We were supposed to be seeing 200 council seats lost. We were supposed to be seeing the worst results for 34 years for a Labour opposition. It wasn't that bad in the context of what was taking place with the constant attacks on the leadership from the backbenches, all the rest of it. On the other hand, Corbyn's strategy is partly to mobilise non-voters, the people who've abandoned the Labour Party. Maybe about 5 million voters between 1997 and 2010. And most of those people who don't turn out tend to be disproportionately poor, working class and young. Those are also the people it's very hard to turn out at a local election. So we can't really tell what's going to happen in 2020 on the basis of this. I would just say, any leader of the Labour Party at this point, given the scale of the Labour Party crisis and its long build-up, would have incredible difficulty in winning the 2020 general election.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. Stephen, your 60 seconds.
I think it sort of depends on where you're talking about Jeremy Corbyn being electable. In Scotland, where there was this idea that a sort of more full-throated Labour Party would be the secret to electoral revival, that has been tested to destruction and the thesis has been found wanting. The difficulty for Labour is if politics is along constitutional lines, you have one party of social democratic independence and one party of right-wing status quoism, and it's very difficult to see where the space for Labour is, regardless of its leader. There are parts of England where clearly what we might call Corbynism is very electorally potent. Bristol, London, Norwich, places where, as Suzanne Evans said when she was asked to explain why UKIP did so badly in London, educated, cultured and young. In fact, Labour does very well in places which have the demographics of the whole of Britain in 30 years hence. However, unfortunately, in the places where Britain has the demographics of Britain in 2016, it did rather less well. And all of the indications are, it was still its worst election since 1985, which was the prelude to a Conservative landslide. All of the indications are that it will continue to suffer. The question is whether or not there's a leader who is capable of doing better than that or simply changing strength in one place for weakness in another.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. Hilary.
Yes, firstly I think it showed that Jeremy Corbyn is not toxic, so it wasn't a disaster. So, he's kind of almost electorally neutral, and I think there's the potential of him winning. So I think that there was exactly the point that Stephen's made, that he did exceedingly well in places that he wasn't really expected to do well, the southwest, many places in the south, places like Cambridge, and okay, that's the explanation, culturally educated, etc. But he didn't do badly in places like Manchester. You know, the vote went up in Manchester. They only lost one seat to a Lib Dem who used to be an MP and who's an incredibly good caseworker. You know, so, but I don't want to deny that it's a disaster in terms of what it should be at this stage. So I think that it shows that, you know, he can win, but he's got to do certain things. For instance, I think Scotland obviously was the big disaster from the point of view of winning. You know, they need Scotland. And for me, they've got to start thinking about an electoral alliance. There's got to be that sort of openness.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hilary. And finally, Neal?
I don't think it really matters what the electoral outcome of last Thursday was. You know, it's so early, as Richard said. You know, this was the biggest defeat, you know, since that, I don't know, 70 years or something. And the issue isn't whether he's building the electoral base yet. Of course you're not going to build the electoral base. You shouldn't expect him to. What you should expect in kind of 7 months to a year is, are you beginning to build the kind of underlying kind of philosophy, vision, organisational basis for a kind of renewal of social democracy? And that's the problem. This isn't a crisis for the Labour Party. This is a crisis of social democracy in every corner of the planet. So expecting Jeremy Corbyn in 7 months to kind of reinvent social democracy, you know, given that defeat and given that kind of existential crisis, was ridiculous. The question is he starting to build the foundations for renewal or not? That's what we should test him on, and that's what we should talk about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neal. Thanks for all those answers. What I'd like us to talk about now is some of the more short-term issues which were the prelude to this election. We had potentially trumped up scandals, a coalition between the right-wing Labour Party and the media to undermine Corbyn's party as seeming like something you can vote for. Given that those are going to remain, do you think that Corbyn can be operating in a more successful way in this hostile environment?
I think that it can do, provided it remembers the lessons of what this conjuncture is about. If it tries to obey the usual sort of techniques of managing news cycles and all the rest of it, Corbyn's not able to do that. His team aren't able to do that, and his kind of politics can't thrive in that particular kind of climate. What they've been very good at doing, and how they won the Labour leadership election in the first place, was using social media as a means of providing oppositional messages, because when you've got large numbers of people who distrust not just the political class, as they call it, but also the media, which is attached to it, then you can actually find that you benefit from being attacked in the media, provided you provide some sort of argument against it. But they've also got a longer term objective. They're going to have to find a way to reach out to people on a face-to-face basis. And that's more about building up the fabric of the grassroots. Mm-hmm. And that's something, I mean, because most of the activists that they've recruited are not actually active. Mm-hmm. So that's something that they're going to have to take a long time to build up.
I mean, that's another thing that...
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I think, you know, in a way, the London experience is very sort of revealing, because, you know, talk about, you know, a toxic campaign. I mean, you know, Khan and the Labour Party and Jeremy, you know, witnessed or faced, you know, victims of the most vicious kind of all guns blazing campaign against them. You know, everything. You know, which led, you know, Cameron and Goldsmith and so on into the terrain of being quite racist and divisive, and they suffered for that. But so, you know, what enabled Khan to win, and apart from his own, you know, dignity and the sort of basic nature of his campaign appealing to the needs of the mass of Londoners, I think it shows that in some places the new recruits and the new movement, momentum and so on, is a force, an electoral force. The new membership, the sort of movement that Corbyn created, it's not a force everywhere, you know, so I don't want to be romantic about it, but I think in London it certainly is, and in a way shows what could be done elsewhere if the Labour Party was to open up to it and welcome it.
You're someone who's followed Labour before and after Corbyn.
Yeah.
Do you see a genuine increase in the mobilisation of people knocking on people's doors?
No, there has not. I think Richard is exactly right to say that a lot of people are very excited about Jeremy Corbyn, but they are not doing any of the things that I think are necessary to get that movement out and going places.
But what about in London?
Apart from in London, but the London Labour Party's always been very big and active. I mean, the London Labour Party secured its best ever results in 2014 in the local elections before it went down to crushing defeat on a nationwide stage. So that only gets you so far. I think Sadiq Khan's victory shows a couple of things. One, that you can win in the face of an unremittingly hostile media landscape. I mean, kind of the Evening Standard was sort of well and above even the worst excesses of the Murdoch press in this election. The second is that if you can get people on doors and you can get a message that appeals to, Sadiq Khan won over voters who voted for Boris Johnson in 2012 and 2008. And you can do that without necessarily sacrificing your values, etc., etc. But you need to have a message which resonates with people who backed the Conservatives at the last election.
So we've got social media, people on the ground. There were focus groups released this morning, today being Monday, that were saying people in, this was Nuneaton, won't vote for a divided party. Yeah, so whilst you have Corbyn, who's got no control over the PLP, whatever we go for, however many people we have on the ground, there are voters in the centre who aren't going to vote for Labour. This has led some commentators to argue for some sort of grand truce. Is that plausible?
It is in a sense, but I think they're already trying to do that. They've got a cabinet with the likes of Hilary Benn in it. It's not a completely Corbynite cabinet. It's not advancing the kind of Bennite policies that Corbyn would like to advance. He's compromised on NATO, he's compromised on the EU, he's compromised on nationalisation. This is why Polly Toynbee, who knows a thing or two about splitting from the right of the Labour Party, said that it wouldn't work this time, because Corbyn is just reaching out to too many people within the Labour Party.
But look, there are real deep structural problems about the divisions between the groups in the Labour Party. There's always been a left and a right in the Labour Party, but the left, the kind of hard left that Corbyn represents, has always been marginal. Now, all of a sudden, you've got kind of two competing blocks equally of equal strength. You've got the Corbyn who are strong in the party and the unions, and you've got the right who are strong in the PLP and the media. Now, and they're on different planets. They are electorally, they are on different planets because they just believe in different things, in different strategies, they have different cultures, they want to go in different directions. That's one reason why proportional representation is rising up the kind of ranks of interest within the PLP, because Chukramana doesn't want to be in the same party as John McDonnell, and John McDonnell doesn't want to be in the same party as Chukramana. Now, they both know that the only way you can break that open is with PR. You can't do it before you've got PR, because that way it leads the SDP or UKIP, 4 million votes and one seat. So they'll want some kind of deal at the next election where a progressive alliance promises PR. Then they can go their different ways. So I think we're in kind of uncharted territory about the potential breakup of the Labour Party because of the failure of Blairism, the apparent electoral failure of Corbynism, shifting the big tent from the centre to the left, is that going to work?
And so PR could be the one thing that unites the Labour Party, so they can in fact divorce.
You've got a campsite which you can all occupy, you can do the deals in public, you can have your spats in public and work your way through a centre and centre-left agenda. I think lots of people are moving onto that territory now.
Okay, so we've come today to Thurrock. It was a key marginal in the 2015 elections. Tories, Labour and UKIP all getting over 30%. UKIP had a big day here on Thursday, winning 6 extra seats on the council. They're now joint first with the Tories. They took 4 from Labour. This is a must-win seat for Corbyn's Labour. We'll ask people here what they think of his leadership. And did you vote on Thursday?
I did.
Would you mind telling me who for?
UKIP.
UKIP? What were the main issues that drove your vote?
Well, they helped a lot of people around here, and I'm fed up with the others.
Who have you voted for historically?
Labour.
Labour. And would you consider voting them again?
No, not at the moment.
What do you think of Jeremy Corbyn?
No comment.
Do you imagine you'd vote UKIP in 2020 as well?
Certainly. Oh, definitely, without a doubt. I wouldn't vote for any other party. I come from a Labour background. I couldn't vote Labour now.
And why not?
Because they're not old Labour. They're not Labour as they used to be. I'm not interested in them because I'm staunch UKIP. I listen to Mr Farage, I've met Mr Farage, he's a wonderful, wonderful person. What you see is what you get.
Have you guys ever voted?
Never, no.
You ever considered it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
And what would swing it? What would get you to vote?
To get on the electoral roll for a start.
I don't actually know anything about who you vote for. I
What issues do you care about? If you had a politician come here, what would you want them to say to
don't
you?
have any issues. I like to be quiet, get on with life.
No, I do.
Yeah?
You do?
Yeah, big Muslim issue. I know that's very racist, but it's really bad.
An issue's an issue.
An issu's an issue, yeah.
Like ISIS and all of that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. To be fair, I'm only fearing for the safety of our own country, people.
Okay, so you fear that
But
they might all get together and
I
do
think
something?
the biggest issue at the minute is terrorism. That is the biggest
Without a
issue.
doubt, I'd say
Biggest
so.
issue, and it's the biggest threat to everyone.
So the Tory party, you have cut benefits, you're generally supportive of that policy?
Yeah, that's now Conservative doing these things. That's good for this country, that's good for Britain.
We're now in Ilford North. This was a key marginal in the 2015 election, something Corbyn will have to hang on to in 2020. We're here to find out whether London voting for Sadiq means London will vote for Corbyn.
Green Party.
Green Party, OK.
Yeah, I'm
And
all
what-
green.
What issues would be driving your vote?
I think the main thing would be, I would say, housing for I mean, obviously I'm a young person and I know at the moment my generation is struggling to get on the housing market.
I work for GlaxoSmithKline.
Brilliant. And did you vote last Thursday?
Oh, yes, I did.
Can I ask who for?
I was going to go for Goldsmith, but then as I reached the booth, I changed my mind and I went for Sadiq Khan.
OK, great. Yeah. And normally, what party do you tend to vote for?
Tories.
For the Tories?
Yeah.
So if there are a general election tomorrow, who do you think you'd vote for?
I'll vote for the Tories.
Yeah?
I'll give them my vote.
Do you think there's anything that the Labour Party could do to attract your vote for the next election?
I'm just worried about their economics. I'm just concerned about how they'll manage the economy and what their plan is in terms of how they're going to use the resources, etc., etc.
If there were a general election tomorrow, who do you think you might vote for?
I would definitely vote Labour. Definitely vote Labour. I'm all for supporting everybody, right? Now, I don't want to stigmatise anybody, but Conservatives have come in and it was like, bang! And I think it was all too much too soon. Because of the nature of my job, I got to see a lot. So many people, it had an impact on so many people. And I think that's wrong, you know.
Can I ask your opinion on Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party?
I can't speak much on Jeremy Corbyn. I don't know him much, but what I'm seeing, for me, he's not the face of Labour.
Oh, and what do you mean by that?
When I see him on the telly, this is my personal opinion, I'm not excited, I'm not moved. I just see somebody that is, he's not the type of person that can inspire, he doesn't inspire me.
Now, obviously, that wasn't a very scientific piece of research. That was just us spending 2 hours in 2 town centres. But it does fit somewhat into a broader narrative about Britain being divided, or England at least, being divided into 2 types of cities and towns. Those left behind by globalisation, where socially conservative attitudes prevail, and as we saw in that video, anti-immigrant sentiment and outright racism. And those areas that are more booming, places like Ilford, Bristol, Manchester, where people have more cosmopolitan attitudes, and where at the moment Labour is going down all right. To win in 2020, Labour will have to win both of these constituencies. Do you see any way that the Labour Party can bridge this divide, can appeal to both of these groups, and can it do so under Corbyn? Richard?
I would say not on the basis of patronising them and not on the basis of trying to flatter their prejudice. Labour has tried this in the past. Blue Labour has been pioneered. This whole idea of triangulating UKIP doesn't work. They just know that they're being patronised. They know they're being sold a bill of goods. If they want racist politics, they know where to vote for it. Mr. Farage, he'll give it to them. So we've got to look at this in a longer term perspective. Where is anti-immigrant politics coming from? You mentioned some of the material basis for this in the sort of different connections to globalization, patterns of immigration and all the rest of it. But there's also just the fact that in the last 15, 20 years or so, there's been a concerted political effort to make this, to drive it up the political agenda. Here I think that the Blairite commentator Dan Hodges, I don't agree with him on much, but he made the point that New Labour was paranoid about being outflanked on anything by the Conservatives. And when immigration came up and they realised they were not winning on immigration, they decided that they would try and hammer the Tories on immigration from the right. And all this did was validate the concerns of the far right. It gave the BNP talking points, and of course the BNP themselves acknowledged this and boasted about it, and it helped push it up the agenda.
Are you blaming Well, not blaming, but are you showing a direct link between New Labour's politics and anti-immigrant sentiment in
Absolutely,
places like Thurrock? What's the relation? I think it's interesting.
The relationship is that New Labour was able to speak to ordinary working class people in a way that, say, for example, Thatcher wasn't able to do, and to communicate the ideas of the right, which is what they were, in a language that would be acceptable to their voters. At the cost, of course, of losing quite a lot of their voters who didn't buy into these values, and at the cost of
other cost of engendering
racism and shifting the agenda to a terrain that actually wasn't even advantageous to New Labour, and particularly not in its cosmopolitan mood.
What sort of politics could displace what UKIP have so successfully done in these regions?
Well, the problem is that's patronising in of itself, isn't it? That's saying, I know you're saying you're concerned about this, but actually what you're really concerned is the issues that I'm also concerned about. I don't think that works either. I also dispute the idea that there wasn't a problem with racism among Britain's working classes, or indeed Britain's upper classes, before 1997, but that's, I think, a conversation for another time. What I think all of those people are looking for is strength, right? Then there's a lot of things, and I'm sure those people would say that were fairly uncritical about David Cameron, but he looks the part. If he was the Prime Minister in Doctor Who or whatever, people would think, yeah, you look faintly plausible to me. I think if you have a position of strength, if you look reasonable, actually Cameron looking reasonable has allowed him to be a fairly right-wing, in fact I'd argue probably the most right-wing Prime Minister, probably since the war, because he has that posture of strength and that posture of reasonableness. The difficulty under Ed, so you've got to win Kensington and Harlow, but kind of Labour under Ed kind of went, oh, maybe we'll try and win both. I think Labour needs to basically work out what its most appealing frontman is, work out who that person's talents, politics, skills, agenda, and go hell for leather towards winning that seat. And I think that actually, if you've got a strong message which says, I think the future is London, I think the future is here, then that fixes some of the problem. Because, the non-voters who are saying, I'm worried about ISIS, they don't want to be told that actually the problem is something else. They want someone who looks strong. They don't have to then look strong in Black Extraordinary Rendition. Just the fact they look strong is enough.
Yeah, I don't completely agree with that. I think, that we do need an alternative agenda that's not patronising. But I think, in a way, the strong leader is kind of, it's not, well, it maybe is patronising, but it's kind of displacing people's powerlessness. Thurrock, the complete destruction of the docks and the economy around that. The political power of the sort of places like Thurrock is completely diminished, so that there is a problem of powerlessness, economic and political. And so their sort of fear about terrorism, a lot of the things they said was to do with feeling utterly powerless, so kind of hitting out at, rather random.
People are going to be less frightened of ISIS because we have the D'Hondt electoral system. I think I'm a massive zealot for electoral reform, which I do think ultimately is a class issue, because the votes that are piled up on the first past vote are not mostly the votes of people.
But why, it's not, when I'm not talking, the challenge of the constitutional process is not to avoid putting it all in terms of, particular electoral systems and the sort of technical minutiae. But, why do, you talked about earlier about the places that are voting Labour being the places of, educated, cultured, etc. Now, what is education and culture? It's about feeling powerful and confident. And so that means a politics that takes the people of Thurrock seriously, discusses with them
there's a problem between this tension between patronising those voters or accepting that their concerns are legitimate and then speaking to them, or what I felt like was potentially your one of ignore them, which was kind of the New Labour strategy, right? You get a competent leader who potentially enough swing voters can vote for you, and you kind of ignore the people of Thurrock and hope that you can just build them out of your electoral strategy.
Parties have to build out from what their values are and what they want to achieve, and then you work out how you're going to get the votes for what you want to achieve. You don't start by going, well, actually, you don't really mean these things.
Look, the Labour Party could form majorities in the past because there was a much simpler kind of class basis for politics, and you could draw together an amalgam of kind of, more working class and some middle class people into a winning coalition. And then kind of Blairism came along and could plonk its big tent down with 60 consecutive quarters of growth, and distributional problems were put to one side, and everyone was sick of the Tories. Now, none of that applies anymore because you can't, with rampant neoliberalism and inequality and all of that, you can't reproduce New Labour. So what do you do? Now, it seems to me, on one hand, I think that there's a kind of, the feelings of insecurity and anxiety in this country stretch from way up the middle classes, way down through the social income brackets. Now, is there a way of talking about that which can unite those? I'm not sure. I think it's difficult because I think the country now is much more fragmented. It's much more complex. It's very hard to come up with a national discourse that can unite all of those people. But I would say that people both feel disenfranchised and remote from the political system. Labour always does well when it has a message about modernity. 1945, 1964, even 1997. The modernisers in the Labour Party stopped modernising a long time ago. Jeremy, is finding it difficult to find a language of modernity. That's the place in which Labour could begin to have a national message if there was a kind of political leadership that could begin to articulate.
I think he could learn a lot from the Livingston's DLC. I know mentioning Livingston is a bit controversial in this context, but let's look at what happened there. He was extremely popular, and essentially what he did was to share power. He was not patronising. He opened up, a very, a sort of institution of state from which people were very alienated. They weren't like looking to Livingston as a strong person. They were looking to Livingston because he reflected what they cared about. And I think Jeremy's leadership has got the potential to do that. It's not kind of realised quite the kind of potential narrative.
I think one thing we can't miss out after these elections is Scotland. One of the main stories from this was absolute collapse in Scotland. What can they do about that?
Honestly, I don't know. In my more optimistic moments, I think the reason why the SNP attack worked was because people didn't think Ed Miliband would stand up to anyone. And the reason why, no one would say David Cameron was in Nick Clegg's pocket because people felt that David Cameron stood up to Nick Clegg, etc., etc. I don't think that people worry, even people who don't like Jeremy Corbyn, that Jeremy Corbyn won't stick to what he believes in.
Yeah.
So my instinct is the SNP attack line doesn't work if people have a sense that the Labour Party in England cares about the interests of England and will stand up for the interests of England. So I think that actually is a problem which kind of takes care of itself. Of course, if I'm horrifically wrong, it turns out that unless Scotland goes independent, Labour can never win an election again in England, but I prefer not to think about that.
More generally, so Labour's got to talk to the SNP in Scotland and lance that boil and start to have a grown-up conversation. It's got to do a deal with the Greens. It shouldn't stand against Caroline Lucas in Brighton Pavilion, and Green voters should back Labour people in other places on the basis of that. There's got to be some deal with the Liberal Democrats in the South West, where only the Liberal Democrats can defeat the Tories and Labour will never be able to. We've got to push the Liberal Democrats to be in a progressive position on who they'd want to do a kind of coalition deal with. All of that stuff has got to be done now and worked on now, not left to the last moment. Whatever you think about the performance last Thursday, it was nowhere near enough to get, to think about a Labour majority. A progressive alliance is the only basis to get the Tories out.
Brilliant. We're running out of time, so we're going to move to our final 1 minute round. Okay. You can put all your points in your final 1 minute round. So it's a broad question. What do you see as the prospects for Labour in the coming months and years, and what do you think should be the priorities for Corbyn? I'm beginning with Neal this time.
Well, I think that there's an existential crisis of social democracy, not just in Britain but across the world. Expecting Jeremy to sort that out in 7 months is an impossible task. I would expect him to start trying to lay some of the groundwork intellectually, organisationally and programmatically to begin to get us out of that hole, and everyone should help him in that process. But I'm very sceptical about whether social democracy, a 20th century creed, can adapt itself to the 21st century. It was a creed of hierarchy, of bureaucracy, of technology, of kind of Fordism, of top-downism, of a politics of social democracy done to people and not with people. And so I think it's got to adapt to that kind of, can it adapt to that more kind of network society? And can it just begin, programmatically? It's really simple stuff. Basic income, shorter working week. These are policies that would appeal to thousands and millions of people, with the funding there from the technology companies. That's the sort of area that Labour should move into.
Brilliant.
Okay, yes, so I agree with a lot of what Neal's just said. And I think that actually Jeremy's got the potential for that. I think all the time I'm feeling there's the potential there in terms of both his attitude to life and to politics. Because I don't think actually it is about social democracy. It's far deeper than that. It's about politics. It's about the way in which power and the institutions of power are organised. He's really got to flesh out that notion of new politics. He won the leadership not by saying he was going to change the Labour Party and so on, but because he was going to introduce a new politics, and he's got to make that mean something. And that is about, completely different understanding of the state, so that it's about a decentralised state, opening up the state, listening to frontline workers. Just take Hillsborough, it's a kind of classic. The police have never been the most democratic of our institutions, but even, the formal democracy that is meant to govern the police was completely useless. It took, 90 families, more probably, over 27 years of their life to get change.
Stephen?
I don't think that social democracy is dead. I think that the problems may manifest in different ways, but there is still a vital need for a politics which wants to stop us from destroying the planet, wants to combat the problems of poverty, inequality, injustice, etc. And as long as that mission remains, then there will always be a hope for social democratic politics in the UK and worldwide. One of the things that Jeremy Corbyn can do is that if you run a local authority well, you suddenly have a promise to the people who live there, which isn't based on an abstract and people go, well, where's the money coming from? You can go, well, look, we did this when we took over the council, and we'll do this if you give us the parliamentary seat. So the really important thing is these councils they've held on to, London, which they've won, Bristol, which they won, is to run them well on left-wing lines, to be competent and to be exciting, dynamic, to be doing really things. And if they can get that, if they can solve that problem, if they can go to marginal voters in, I forget which one of the Bristol seats is Conservative held, but if they can say, look at what we've done, look at what Marvin Rees has done in 2020, that is a big and potentially transformative offer.
And to finish off, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, Corbyn is trying to solve Labour's problems from the left. That's a difficult project because it involves a number of different things which are somewhat in tension. First of all, you've got to rebuild the grassroots and you've got to get them active. But doing the kinds of things to get them active and excited are not the same sort of things you have to do to get the parliamentary party in line, to get the media on side, and to win over swing voters in Nuneaton or wherever, okay? And Labour is fundamentally a constitutionalist and electoralist party to its marrow. So how does it manage that tension? We talked about Scotland and the whole national question. How is he going to talk about electoral alliances in a party that is unionist to its core and always has been? And Jeremy Corbyn is very traditionally Labourist in many ways. So how are they even going to broach that question? I just think he's faced with an almost impossible task of trying to juggle many, many different things at once. I think he'll make some progress on several fronts. I think he's obviously recruited very many people to the Labour Party. He's rebuilding the core vote, but going beyond that is going to be very difficult.
Brilliant. Thanks for all those answers, and thank all of you for coming on The Fix. As ever, you can catch our next episode on Novara Media.